Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to Business Daily. I'm Han Da-eun filling in for Lee Ji-yoon today. Before we get started, let's first get a glimpse of today's highlights. A Korean telecom operator has taken drone technology to the next level, unveiling the world's first drone-based LTE service. We'll show you how that will help save more lives. And in global business news this week, a pre-session analysis on the upcoming UN Climate Change Summit with Eunice Kim and much more. So don't go away. But before we get to that, Korea's ruling Saenuri Party and the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy have agreed to work towards ratifying the Korea-China Trade Pact by next week. Saenuri Party is hoping to have the pact passed both by the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee and the plenary session on Monday. But the opposition party has maintained it'll not offer its seal of approval until Wednesday unless sufficient measures of protection and compensation for those affected by the deal are drawn up. The Korea-China FTA was signed back in June, but is still awaiting ratification at the National Assembly. This meeting comes after President Park Geun-hye strongly urged lawmakers to get the trade pact ratified as soon as possible. And it's not just the president. Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan is also calling for the ratification of the Korea-China Trade Pact by year-end in order to boost the country's ailing exports. Chairing an economy-related ministers' meeting on Friday, Choi emphasized that the country's sagging exports in October, which fell by the largest margin in 6 years, is starting to negatively impact the country's industrial production and business investments. He also added that as Beijing has already finished all domestic procedures to implement the pact, Seoul must also end unnecessary disputes and finalize its decision. The minister also explained Korea's exporters will benefit from additional tariff cuts if the trade pact goes into effect before the end of the year. The deal is projected to push up bilateral trade to roughly $300 billion a year and eventually lift Korea's GDP by about 1% in the next decade. With a high youth unemployment rate, a thorn in the side of Korea's economic policymakers, the government plans to help young job seekers to look for work overseas. At an economy-related ministers' meeting on Friday, the Finance and Labor Ministry said they will aim to double the number of young Koreans working abroad from the annual 5,000 as of last year to 10,000 in 2017. The government will adopt different training programs to support young job seekers interested in working in one of the 15 designated countries that are deemed to have ample job opportunities. The countries include the United States, Japan, and Singapore. Korean stocks fared relatively well among major indices this year, rebounding from last year's slump. According to data collected by local research firm FN Guide, Korea's benchmark Kospi as of Wednesday was up nearly 5% compared to the end of last year. In terms of returns, Korea ranked 7th out of the world's 20 major markets over that period. Last year, the country was a lowly 19th after logging a 4.8% dip in profitability. Experts say this year the index performed strongly due to the improved valuation of Korean stocks. Of the 20 indices, Italy's FTSE MIB index took the top spot with a gain of over 17%, followed by France's CAC 40 and Germany's DAX. According to experts, low oil prices and the strong dollar against the local currencies played key roles in the respective markets. LG Display plans to invest nearly $9 billion in new OLED facilities to tap deeper into the lucrative segment. The Korean company said it'll build a new factory in Paju, north of Seoul, to produce large OLED panels for TVs as well as flexible panels for smaller devices. The company will spend an initial $1.5 billion for the new factory, which is set to be completed in the first half of 2018. Experts say LG Display is ramping up production and investments in an effort to dominate the OLED TV market. When accidents happen out in remote places like near the ocean or in the mountains, it can be very difficult to locate survivors due to spotty mobile phone connectivity. But what if you were to create a mobile cell tower that can travel to different sites on wings? Our Lee Ju-young has more.
This scene is part of a rescue mission staged by one of Korea's biggest telecom companies, KT. An LTE drone device that enables communications network services and is equipped with a thermal camera spots survivors and delivers real-time mobile phone coverage to facilitate search and rescue operations by first responders.
The drone-based LTE can go up quite high and quickly search large areas. I'm confident it will be very useful during natural disasters or other emergencies.
Designated by the Ministry of Land this past October as a trial developer, KT became the world's first company to develop an 800-gram miniature mobile network station that can be loaded onto a drone. This can provide LTE coverage to remote areas like the mountains or the sea, where connections often get spotty. Currently, the drone can operate for 22 minutes within a 5-kilometer radius, reaching as high as 150 meters. But KT said it will double the operating time of its drones to 40 minutes and expand the area of coverage to a 20-kilometer radius by 2018. Other technologies developed by KT are a 9-kilometer backpack LTE, which is a portable LTE network base station, as well as a satellite LTE that uses satellite connection instead of cellular and Wi-Fi networks to expand the golden window in saving lives. The mobile carrier's latest advancements are in line with Korea's efforts to enhance the country's disaster prevention network and provide swifter response times and better connectivity for those in need of help. Lee Ju-young, Business Daily.
Time for a look through some global business stories that made headlines this week. And for that, we're joined by Eunice Kim in the studio. Hello, Eunice. Good to see you.
Hello, Dan.
It's only been 2 weeks now since Paris was rocked by a series of terror attacks. But the French capital is set to host dozens of heads of state for the massive UN climate change summit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. On Sunday, Korea's own President Park Geun-hye will be Paris-bound, joining the likes of U.S. President Barack Obama and Chinese President Xi Jinping. A total of 148 heads of state will be present for this much-anticipated end-of-the-year summit, as eyes turn to what kind of progress can be met to turn the tide on climate change.
Here's COP21, the UN Climate Change Conference in numbers. 2 degrees Celsius. That's the tipping point for the Earth's warming trend world leaders will work hard to avoid, to ward off what scientists say would be truly catastrophic weather patterns, sparking heat waves, drought, and flooding. 606,000. The UN says that's the number of deaths attributed to weather-linked disasters around the world over the past 20 years, with economic losses estimated to come in the trillions of dollars. 1 degree Celsius. The World Meteorological Organization says we're on track for the halfway mark this year, as the globe looks to be experiencing the hottest year on record, stirred by a very strong El Niño in the Pacific Ocean and human activity. While most of the participating 196 countries have submitted their so-called intended nationally determined contributions to cut global carbon emissions, scientists say they'll still put us over the 2-degree wall, a 2.7-degree hike by the year 2100. This is why nobody is expecting a miracle out of the Paris climate change talks. But what is hoped for are ambitious commitments by individual nations to cut and keep cutting emissions until human reliance on dirty fuel is raised altogether.
I think that everyone realizes that this COP will be the beginning of a new phase in the process, not the end in itself. It must, however, send an unequivocal long-term signal to the international community and to global markets that the transition to a low-carbon, sustainable, climate-compatible economy is firmly and irreversibly underway.
And ahead of the giant summit, reports of encouraging signs. The Netherlands Environment Agency says worldwide growth in carbon emissions is nearing flat, increasing by only 0.5% in 2014, shedding a full percentage point from the year before. And the International Energy Agency also took note that half of the world's new power plants last year were designed to produce renewable energy, calling it a clear sign of a transition away from its damaging addiction to dirty energy.
Well, it's good to know that some progress is being made. Now, what's different about this conference this time around is that participating countries are going into it with commitments already submitted to the UN. Am I right?
You're absolutely right. And in fact, that is why they are calling this a bottom-up approach. And it is a heads up going into this conference. And they are certainly hoping that this will help the Paris summit become the first conference of parties to produce a legally binding document that holds all nations accountable to their targets, as opposed to only developing nations, as was the case over in the Kyoto Conference back in 1997. Though it must be said the U.S. has shown some resistance to the idea of making this a legally bound document out of the conference. 40% of global emissions come from U.S. and China has really stepped up initiative here, committing to cut its CO2 emissions by up to 65% of 2005 levels per unit of GDP by 2030, at which point they hope to have peaked their emission intensity. Now, Korea in June said it would cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 37% in the next 15 years, based on business as usual or BAU projections for 2030, which will reach about 850 million tons.
Well, it looks like both China and Korea are aiming high to contribute to global efforts in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But reducing gas emissions is one thing, but quite the other is, of course, building clean energy-reliant infrastructure, right? And they both are far from inexpensive undertakings.
Yeah, you hit it on the nail there, Tan. Probably one of the biggest sticking point going into this conference and in the next few weeks is going to be the money, the cost. Who is going to shoulder the burden? Now, the larger economies like the G7 will likely be able to support their own targets, but what about the developing nations? They won't want to trade growth for carbon cutting, especially when much of the environmental damage was done over many years by the wealthy countries of today. Now, rich countries are putting away money in a fund to help dull the cost of cutting emissions for poorer nations, as agreed at the Copenhagen summit back in 2009. But with the developing economies projecting the cost to implement the changes necessary will be at least $1 trillion. There will be much to be debated these next couple weeks on how the globe as a whole will work together to pivot into a clean energy powered world.
Well, we'll leave climate change there, but staying with Paris, France, of course, is touted as one of the world's top travel destinations. I myself love to travel there, but like many had expected, recent terror attacks are already weighing down on the country's tourism industry.
That's right. The market reaction was more or less resilient following that Friday the 13th terror attack, but it seems that tourism to the French capital may not fare so well. In fact, the French finance minister Michel Sapin on Thursday indicated the terror attacks indeed could have an impact on French growth, which ironically was just beginning to turn the corner in the third quarter. According to travel data company Forward Keys, the number of Paris-bound travelers that canceled plans in the week after the attacks climbed by 21% compared to the week before, while the number of new bookings dropped by 27%. While typically Christmas is a popular time to travel to the City of Lights, especially from Asia, this year holiday bookings were down 13% from the 2% contraction that was seen before these attacks. This comes as a manhunt, of course, continues for that 8th attacker still at large, and as many nations have issued travel alerts to France. The U.S. has issued a worldwide travel alert on heightened risks of terror attacks in the next 3-month period. And finally, just as Korea fined and ordered a recall on 125,000 Volkswagen diesels found to be rigged with the emissions cheating software on Thursday, the German automaker presented its first fix for its affected European vehicles. Explaining that the remedy will vary depending on engine type, Volkswagen said the solution for its 1.6-liter engine will be two-pronged. A so-called flow transformer will need to be installed in front of the air mass sensor to decisively improve its measuring accuracy, followed by a software update, both of which will take about an hour in the shop. VW said the remedy to make its U.S. diesels regulation compliant will be different and is currently under review by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and California Air Resources Board.
Thank you, Eunice, as always, for being here with us today.
Sure thing.
And that wraps it for today and this week. Thank you so much for watching and have a great weekend.